Writing and recording this was an absolute nightmare in trying to pace and organize the video, since as it turns out, the definition I went with / my starting point of thought essentially boiled down to Part 1, science fiction that follows a realistic Newtonian flight model, and Part 2, things that do not do that. And as it so happened, that meant that Part 1 was hard sci-fi pretty much exclusively, which is a relatively small subgenre that I vastly over-explained, and Part 2 was literally everything else ever made in all of science fiction, which I vastly under-explained. So you can imagine the pacing issues that caused. So this is version 5, the 5th full rewrite. Hopefully this time's the charm, but no guarantee. This video is going to be a disaster. I apologize in advance. Blame the channel members. Some of them asked me to dig this script out of the forever box and do it because it's been sitting around on the back burner for literally like a year and a half. Syllabus for today's topic: flight types in science fiction. What are they? How do they work? And the intricacies of, well, at least the first type. Then I talk a little about why each type of flight model is chosen, benefits, downsides, why one type of flight model is vastly more popular than the other, you know, the works. Before we get into it, however, introductions. Generic greetings and welcome to Science Insanity, a channel dedicated to bringing my love of sci-fi to you, the viewer, and occasionally losing my mind as I take on topics way larger than I ever expected and suffer just innumerable technical and personal skill issues. Regardless though, on to the topic of the day. First and foremost, what even is the distinction to be made here? Aren't all examples of spaceships and dogfights and crazy maneuvering pure fiction? Aren't they all unrealistic and practically fantasy? Yes. But not all sci-fi is created equal. Some settings draw far more from real life, following as closely as possible the laws of physics, correct mechanics, and plausible designs, while others just smash their toys together as they scream and make daka 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 noises while running around the bedroom. The first type, Newtonian flight, is almost exclusively tied to hard sci-fi settings, or harder sci-fi settings, as it requires both a massive amount of effort to get right and tends to suck the rest of the setting in like a black hole. The second type, very helpfully described as non-Newtonian, which explains every other sci-fi setting in existence, essentially means any flight model that does not respect those things we just talked about, like conservation of momentum, or physics in general, really. This second category is an absolute nightmare to explain, because every setting is basically its own unique category unto itself. So let's start with the first one instead, a Newtonian flight model that closely or exactly follows physics. To keep things simple, if you ever see a setting's movement or flight described as Newtonian, it's shorthand for being close to real life, and things would behave similarly if they were transposed into real life. There's a common misconception you'll find floating around that this includes things like air reserves or large food stores or reaction drives as part of it. Reaction drives are just non-magical engines. Like, you need fuel to power your engines, no magical fusion torches or sci-fi him-and-a-ha magic in order to make things go. But it's not true. Those things help realism, but they're not actually required for a setting's movement to be considered Newtonian. Any sci-fi setting that follows the laws of motion is Newtonian. Generally, though, anything that violates those laws or any cheaty workarounds is a disqualifier. Inertial dampeners violate conservation of momentum, so they automatically disqualify any setting that uses them. At first glance, people would point to things like the Star Fury or the Viper as examples of Newtonian flight, since they use full 3D maneuvering and actually respect the fact that in space, you don't just stop when you turn off the engines. Ship drifting will never not be cool. But they're an example of a mixed setting where they take some elements from real life but are mostly pure fantasy. The easiest example I can show you without diving into books would be The Expanse, where we see one of the best non-documentary on-screen depictions of Newtonian flight. By the way, retroactive drinking game, every time I say Newtonian or non-Newtonian, take a shot of the hardest liquor you have. You'll be dead within 5 minutes. Back to the example though, ships cannot just point at something and keep burning until they get there, otherwise they'd smash into it at the approximate speed of about to meet God. So they spend half the trip accelerating towards the target, then flip around midway there and decelerate to match the target velocity. Ships don't turn by angling the main engines, since that wouldn't turn the ship the way most people think about it. It would just cause you to spin, and it can get so incredibly complicated. In the earlier few drafts of this script, I had a massive segment on orbital mechanics, which I since cut, but instead of going through all of that, here's one example from it. Let's say you're in the same orbit as a pirate, chasing them down to recover the Krabby Patty secret formula they stole, or something, I don't know. I didn't pay attention to the mission brief, I just heard that it was important to catch the rebel cruiser. If you wanted to catch up with them, most sci-fi just says point at guy, turn engine to maximum overdrive, problem solved. The only issues is that in a Newtonian flight model, your orbit is tied directly with your energy. Mass, shape, size, none of it really matters. Go at this speed, stay in this orbit. It's more complicated, but simplifying it down to a layman's level. Lose speed and your orbit decays until you eventually slam into the planet below. Add speed and you won't catch up with your target, you'll get farther away, which is the most ass-backwards thing ever until you stop and think about it. The reason your ship gets farther away is because by adding energy, you aren't moving forwards, necessarily. You're moving up to a higher orbit relative to the planet below, in whose gravity you're cut. From the pirate's perspective, you might get a little closer, but then rapidly start getting farther away as you literally rise up into the void. You can stay in the same orbit, but move faster by adding a counterforce to the universe's desire to fling you off into space. Essentially, 45-degree angle. Some of that power goes into accelerating you, some goes into stopping you from moving to a higher orbit. You are now catching up with the pirate by drifting at him sideways. And this is why it can be very difficult to talk about Newtonian flight models in science fiction. It's incredibly complicated, often absolutely ridiculous in its portrayal, and hilariously dumb when you try to recreate any of those classic science fiction tropes like space battles or dogfights. The more you try to work real life into your setting, the more it will obliterate your setting and replace it with real life. If you want to keep as much creative freedom as possible, don't feed the black hole. Which, that saying should be on a shirt, honestly. Top text, do not feed. Bottom text, the black hole. Giant kick-ass rendition of a singularity in the middle. Double is a joke, because if you're like me, you will eat anything put in front of you. And unfortunately, I could go on for literal hours with all the intricacies of how real-life space travel would work, the fun interactions it has, and the way it would limit ship designs, but I don't have multiple years to record and edit a 500-hour-long documentary. So instead, let's talk about why people would be dumb enough to stand on the edge of the event horizon and just yeet their creations into it. Number 1, an untapped niche. The Expanse is hard sci-fi, and because it goes so hard into that as a huge focus for everything from the ship designs to the combat to the biology of humans on different planets and the politics therein, it hits a niche that's woefully underexploited on the big screen, being mostly consigned to books. For a lot of people, this was the first time they even realized sci-fi could be something like this. Number 2, some other benefits are free tension and drama, what I like to call the submarine situation. Just like a submarine, the environment itself in hard sci-fi settings is often more of a character, enemy, and obstacle than the actual enemy's obstacles and characters. Once again, maneuvering. In Star Trek, who cares? Do flips, spins, barrel rolls at light speed pulling 10,000 Gs, nothing matters. Inertial dampeners just handle it for you. In the Expanse, physics still applies, so if you try to maneuver too hard or in a janky way, the ship will probably be fine, but the poor people inside are now tomato paste on the walls. So you've got a hard upper limit to what your ships can conceivably do. Everything from the smallest fighters to the largest capital ships might all have different ground levels for their maneuverability. Big ship turns slow, small ship turn fast, real caveman brain stuff here. But they all have the same upper limit, which is however much the human body can survive. This is also why a Newtonian flight model rarely has fighters, and when they do, they replace manned craft with drones. Because when a fighter is capped at the same level of maneuverability as a frigate or cruiser or something, why even make fighters instead of bigger ships with more combat potential? Third reason is a double-edged sword. A Newtonian flight model also imposes limitations on you, and while this sounds like a bad thing, because it kind of is, the limitations on how your ships are capable of moving and what they can do often forces people to come up with interesting or clever solutions to the problem in story beats. Take a chase scene, for example. The Rocinante has a forward-facing gun. Can't shoot back with it spinning to line up a shot. Every time it does, chasing ships have a few seconds to react, dodge, and get a little closer. So the Rosie's crew has to exploit patterns in the enemy pilot, shepherding him into long-range point defense fire that the enemy ship's computer won't warn him against since it's too far away for it to consider relevant. So the enemy ship is crippled when a wall of nearly unnoticeable PDC fire rips into it. You can't really maneuver your way out of a situation like this because, again, a Newtonian flight model just doesn't allow you to pull the crazy maneuvers or ridiculous sci-fi tropes that you'd see in another setting. They really have to think their way out of this shit, otherwise they are not getting out of it. Then take Star Wars. Oh no, the enemy is out of range. What do we do? Just keep going. We stopped for gas before them, so this is a foregone conclusion. I think this is also why hard sci-fi doesn't tend to be made anywhere near as much as science fantasy stuff, because you kind of have to set out directly to make a hard sci-fi setting and then deal with the nitty-gritty stuff. And the biggest part of that is the flight models, because it determines how your ships are going to move, how fights are going to play out, where fights are going to happen, the weapons that they're probably going to be using. And that is like 90% of all the fun, cool stuff that a lot of sci-fi authors get into. Like the big spaceship battles and the big dumb sci-fi fights are like easily half the enjoyment of writing science fiction. But then what about Type 2? Well, here's where the video stalled. You see, simply going everything else is non-Newtonian is technically correct, but a simplification to absurdity. At its most simple, however, non-Newtonian flight models are any movement system where things like conservation of momentum, the laws of motion in general, and all of that good stuff is just ignored in favor of the rule of cool. There are a number of differences in how each setting may go about this, but universally non-Newtonian settings disregard the laws of physics. The most common type you'll see is just World War II in space, or what will henceforth become known as ether-based movement. Smaller ships will bank and turn like the fighter planes of old, while larger ships will lumber and heft around the battle space like great ocean-going warships. The most interesting part about this flight model is that it implicitly and sometimes explicitly says that space is full of stuff. Because 9 times out of 10, the ship designs you see in these settings are aircraft analogs, engines that only line up in one direction, wing-shaped hulls, or just wings. The best example would be something like Star Wars, because all the canon information surrounding how the ships move basically guarantees that there's a mysterious ether that fills up space that ships have to move through. For example, maximum speeds. Ships in Star Wars have a maximum sublight speed. Not maximum accelerations, but maximum speeds. We don't know what they are for 90% of ships, but we do know that they have them. They're measured in megalights per hour, or MGLTs, with ships like the A-Wing and TIE Defender hitting around 120 MGLT top speeds, and some other one-off ships going significantly faster still. This straight up isn't possible. The fact that there is a defined maximum fast on a ship-by-ship basis can't happen unless they're pushing through something akin to air, or ether, a mysterious unknown substance. It's also reinforced by how their ships move. Why are they banking and rolling without changing the directions of their engines at all? Ships like the TIE Fighter have engines that can thrust vector, but the vast majority in Star Wars do not. Then we've got the most obvious setting ever, Treasure Planet. Space is just full of air, I guess. How do breathe? Why do sail work? Don't worry about it. Space is full of stuff, and I will find a way to eat it. So these settings are what I'm going to put in the first category of non-Newtonian flight models, which are ether-based movement. Then we get settings that pay lip service to reality. I am going to tentatively call this subcategory like uncapped or unlimited flight models. Essentially settings that have or pay lip service to real-world physics and Newtonian movement, but decide that that's boring and they don't like the limits, so they just take them away. Star Trek does this. It tacitly acknowledges that reality is real and that things in space will behave like we understand them, but it also has a huge amount of reality-violating technology that it uses to just bypass any downsides and wipe their hands of the consequences. Ships accelerate and maneuver at ridiculous speeds, and nobody turns to soup because inertial dampeners violate conservation of momentum. All of those changes in direction, all of that acceleration, poof, gone, doesn't exist, not a problem, comrade. Mass Effect similarly pays lip service to reality. It acknowledges the laws of physics exist, and it acknowledges that things will behave like they do in real life. Most notably with a very famous speech about not eyeballing accelerator shots, because that slug is going to be someone's problem, whether it be next week or next millennia. But Mass Effect decides that limits are boring, so it invents things like Mass Effect drives, or Mass Effect corridors, or Mass Effect fields, which the titular game is named after, where nothing has mass or their mass is dramatically affected so they can move faster than light speed. Which, you know, not having mass technically means you don't exist, but shh, it's fine. It's fine. We can just casually violate causality and have some fun. It's okay. Don't pay attention to the physics violator behind the curtain. The entire point of disregarding real-world flight characteristics is because it gives an enormous amount of freedom to the creator to do whatever they want. Whether it be the Honorverse bringing 18th century ships of the line into space, whether it be Star Wars aping World War II dogfights and maneuvers, whether it be Treasure Planet doing just whatever it does, and non-Newtonian flight models are honestly closer to soft magic systems in fantasy than they are any concrete system of movement. These types of flight models also cause a few problems, though. The less defined or more open-ended things are, the more likely it is that plot holes pop up, like asking why certain maneuvers or strategies aren't used, or why certain ones are. Case in point, if you have the equivalent of fighter planes that carry ship-busting bombs, i.e. the Y-Wing, why did we get these ridiculous space bombers dropping things vertically on a single spaceship that wasn't... It just... Bad. Everything is bad. It's all bad. This movie sucks. A slightly better example that's going to make me less angry is why in the name of God would you land troops like this during the final battle over Earth rather than coming straight down in Mass Effect? We know Kodiaks can handle pretty insane accelerations and can go straight vertical if they need to without the occupants inside being thrown around. So why are we doing a Vietnam-style helicopter landing through enemy territory heavily infested with anti-aircraft guns? It also opens you up to drift over time, where your setting sticks around long enough that you can suffer a Star Trek and watches things go from the submarine-esque fights of the original series and stuff like that to, well, Star Wars. But round instead of triangular. Ultimately, though, these types of settings are a mainstay of science fiction because they're incredibly easy to implement, and it lets people focus more on their story and overarching settings rather than the ships and how they move. Most audiences will look at magical spaceships flying around as if they were fighter jets, and then just turn their brain off and go, yup, A-okay. Meanwhile, hard sci-fi will get picked apart by every wannabe physicist on the internet for every microscopic error that they've made. Though I will say, for fuck's sake, science fiction, can we at least pretend to remember that space is three-dimensional? Every single time, man. Everyone always lines up on the same axis to do battle in big bricks. Though there might be a good reason for that. Future video concept on the plane of battle, the theoretical reason why every sci-fi fight just devolves into line tactics. Though that functionally brings us to the end of the video. However, I encourage anyone who wants to take a crack at it to explain, add, or suggest their own interpretations of Newtonian flight models. It's a really tough nut to crack because of how nebulous everything is, and it was very difficult to put a specific name or definition to any of the trends that I see cropping up all over science fiction. Again, because in the aforementioned example of like Battlestar Galactica, a lot of settings, it's like a spectrum. They go from one side to the other. Some are far more realistic than others, some are far more fantasy than others, and some are, they're just off doing whatever they're doing in the corner and nobody's paying attention to them. Ultimately though, if you made it to the end of the video, you're clearly the target audience, so why not leave a like, subscribe, comment down below, ring the bell button, do all of that great stuff to help the channel out against the YouTube algorithm. It's greatly appreciated and goes a long way. It's greatly appreciated and does go a long way. If you're feeling a little more generous, we also have channel memberships where you can get access to videos a day or two early, occasionally suggest topics for future videos, and occasionally vote on what future videos get made, as well as very occasionally getting exclusive behind-the-scenes content for cut content or other stuff. If you just want to hang out, we do have a Discord where you can chat with fellow turbo nerds, play video games, talk about your hobby, and generally just be a nerd doing nerd shit. For all the people already supporting the channel, a huge thanks to the coffee vendors, making sure that my war on sleep is ever successful. My blood is like 80% caffeine at this point, and I only slept an hour last night, so one day I shall never sleep again with your help. To the food merchants, making sure that starvation is an ever far away foe, a great thank you to you as well. I enjoyed a wonderful burger today, courtesy of all of you. And the arms dealers providing all the tools and toys you saw in today's video for hands-on experimentation and demonstration, a massive thanks to them as well. I have no idea what I'm gonna do with a massive armada of physics-breaking ships now hovering in space above me, but God, the dump is gonna charge me so much to get rid of all of this. Good God. I'll see you next video for big stompy robots.